Okay, hello everyone. We are going to talk about comparing Relay Modern and Apollo at this talk at the ReactiveConf. And I'm pretty excited about these two clients. I don't know if you have been following GraphQL this past year, but we have seen a lot of changes going on. And I'm going to cover one of the most common questions. And when you start a new GraphQL project, you probably are thinking, okay, so cool, yay, we are going to use this new technology from Facebook, which is GraphQL. But then the next thing that you will be thinking of is which client you're going to use. And actually, we have these two different options. And I'm going to go through the different features so you can have this overall picture of what you can use from each of these two different clients. Before I go into the details, I want to introduce myself. So I'm a Google Developer Expert, and this is a title that Google gives to some of the most active community contributors. And it allows me to go to a lot of conferences and events like this one. So it's pretty fun. I also do some other things, like I was at the panel before, and I also do these Master of Ceremonies. And this is some things that I do besides speaking, which you can see, maybe recognize some of the people. Besides doing these events and conferences, I also do quite a lot of blogs. And around this topic of GraphQL, I wrote this little blog comparing GraphQL using React and Angular, which is quite interesting. And actually, I come with an Angular background. But I got into React by using this GraphQL technology, which is quite interesting. As a speaker, I've been giving talks for the last 2 years, and you can see that I'm all over the place. The only thing that it's not done is Moscow, which I'm going to be in December. Looking forward to it. I've spoken at 55 events, which is quite a lot. If you count 12 months, that's 24. So I've done more than double that number. Obviously, I've started doing trainings because of these materials that I was preparing for conference talks. And I started doing trainings, which you can follow. I don't have any specific trainings on React or GraphQL, but maybe next year I can work on some of them. In London, I run a community related to GraphQL, which is GraphQL London, and you can see that it's pretty popular. We can publish all of the meetups that we do, so you can follow these different talks that we cover. This year we had one of the creators of GraphQL and some other people from the Apollo team. And these are really interesting talks that you can follow from anywhere. This year I also participated in this bootcamp, which is quite interesting, which is React in flip-flops. And this is this year, so this is a coming event. And well, actually it has passed already. But the one that I was attending this year, earlier this year, was the one from Max and Nick. And you can see I was invited to do a small talk on GraphQL. You can see me here. This bootcamp is quite cool because you can also do some surfing lessons, not related to any development. And yeah, the location was really great. This is Canary Islands, so that was fun. You can see some pictures here doing crazy things. Okay, so let's jump into the topic. So one way to look into these different clients in GraphQL is looking at the timeline. So what has happened in these past years? And it all starts in 2012. And Facebook released this new client that is using native, mobile native app, which is very much like this screenshot that I added here. And probably you have been using this client at the time, or maybe later. And that was already using this GraphQL technology. And this was created by Facebook to migrate from HTML5 to native mobile apps. So it's been used in production for quite a long time. It's not until 2015 that GraphQL goes open source. And this is a time when Facebook decides to open source the project, and they create what's the first implementation of Relay, which is now called Relay Classic. Then in 2016, GitHub announces all of the public APIs will be using GraphQL, and that's a big milestone for GraphQL, for the technology to reach more developers. And you can use these APIs with any GraphQL client. There's also a few other changes. We have the new website from GraphQL, which is graphql.org. And we have the first conference focused only in GraphQL, which is the GraphQL Summit in San Francisco. Actually, this conference is happening right now. So if you are following GraphQL Summit in San Francisco, you can follow some of the content being produced there. We are going to talk about the new version of Apollo Client, and that's Apollo Client version 2. And I'm hoping that they will release it during this conference, so just stay tuned. This year we have got some other highlights around GraphQL, and earlier this year we got the first version of Apollo Client, which is Apollo Client 1.0, and later on, just a couple of months ago, we got the second version of Relay, which is called Relay Modern. And that's more or less what triggered the talk that I'm going to cover today. How we compare these two clients. And as you can see, these are quite recent in time, so they are more or less giving you the same features. And I'm going to try to answer the questions about which of the two clients you should use. One way of looking at this is by looking at how popular these projects are in NPM. And I like to look into these graphics, and you can see that in orange we have Apollo Client, which is version 1, and then we have Relay at the bottom. So you can see that it's slightly more popular. But that's not the only thing that we are going to cover today. But that's just a start. There's some tooling that has been released this year, and probably the most interesting is this tool called Launchpad. And it allows you to create GraphQL servers online and share the endpoint to build any clients. There's also a new website that was just recently released, and this is graphql.com, and that will give you a lot of the tutorials and guides for the different technologies that you can use GraphQL, and this is, I would say, the go-to website. The other website that I shown before, that was graphql.org, this is also still a good reference site. And I couldn't forget about the GraphQL Summit, which is happening right now, or is going to start in the next couple of hours. So we are pretty excited about learning about this new Apollo Client 2.0. And we are going to have some guests talking about this. We'll see how we do that. So let's start talking about Relay Modern. So Relay Modern is the library built by Facebook, and we have now Relay Classic and Relay Modern, and that's going to have some interesting features. As you know, this is created by Facebook, and we are talking now about release 1.4.1, And that's the latest release of Relay Modern. This integrates only with React. So if you are using React, that could be a good option for you. We have seen how many downloads we have for these two different clients. There's also the stars. I don't know if you look at the stars at GitHub, but that's some data that we can use. And probably the most important is that they are using now MIT license. And this is starting with this 1.4.1 release. So you can now use this Apollo Relay Modern without worrying about the licensing, which has been one of the worries by using these libraries. So what features give you? The main focus of Relay Modern is performance. So that's something that you have to take into account when using this library. The way that achieves this is by using a specific compiler and a Babel plugin that will go and check all of your queries and find the most performant usage for them. So that will be part of the building process. During this time, there will be some optimizations that will be applied. And this is something that you can see, the improvements of performance when you try some of the proof of concepts. What happens when you use Relay Modern is that you will start seeing how Facebook manage different abstractions. And it just depends how familiar you are with these abstractions that you will find it easy to use. There's a concept that is called collocation that it's very interesting. We will have the queries which they use in the form of fragments together with the different components. And that will give us some interesting properties. They also use a custom implementation of the store. And that can be a good thing or a bad thing. For Apollo, we can see that they are using Redux. And if you are familiar with Redux, it will be very familiar to you. With Relay Modern, they use this custom store that will mean that you need to learn a different stack. Then we can see these different concepts. We have connections, records, and fields. And these are not specific to GraphQL. So these are some other concepts that we have to learn, which are more in these Facebook abstractions. We also have the concept of the viewer, which is the user accessing this information, and also some helpers to do pagination. These abstractions will help you if you are implementing these use cases. So that's also a good thing when you are trying to build some more complex applications. Some of the code that you will have to write, it will be available to you. Let's look now into Apollo Client. And this is the other popular, much popular library to implement our GraphQL clients. So as an overview, this project is maintained by Meteor. And the last release is 1.9.3. Just to mention again that they are about to release Apollo 2. And probably the most interesting thing is that they integrate with different frameworks. It's not only integrated with React, but it can also be used with Angular and Vue. So it's interesting for these other frameworks. It's also a popular project, so you can see from the stars. And some of the main features, I would say that Apollo Client is more community-driven. You can see a lot of more collaboration from the community. There's this simplicity when you are building the different features from GraphQL. You won't have to introduce any extra abstractions. We were talking about these abstractions like the pagination from the Relay Modern. So you don't have these extra layers of abstractions, which makes development a little bit simpler. And it uses familiar libraries like Redux. So that's something that you need to take into account if your team is familiar with those. The integration with other frameworks we have covered. And I also have some points here for Apollo 2, and I'm going to go quickly over them. So there's this new concept of modular network layer, and that's using observables from RxJS. That's an addition for the new version. We can also use some new directives that were not implemented before. So we can use this live and defer in our queries. This is also introducing other stores, so we can abstract the store and use, for example, Movex or some other stores that you may be using today. There's this large improvement on the bundle size. And we have seen a lot of the frameworks putting a lot of focus on making the bundles smaller. That will make your application faster on the initial load. And this can also be critical for mobile applications. It's much faster than the previous version. And there's some new implementations involving the local cache. And this will be when you are using large data sets. So these are a few interesting new additions. The migration is not complicated at all. And maybe I'm just pointing some of these new features, but we have some guests from the Apollo client. I think they can give you some more details. So you can, don't be shy. Yeah, come on. So we have, you can come on from this side. So we have Yuri and Peggy from the Apollo team. Maybe you can give some extra details on these few points.
Yeah, so hi everyone, my name's Peggy and I am an open source engineer on the Apollo team. And we're really excited about the new 2.0 version. It was actually released yesterday. So we're super excited about
Cool.
this. And the two main differences between Apollo Client 2.0 and 1.0 is now it's much more modular and you have the ability to customize both the cache and the network stack. So as Gerard was explaining, now you have the ability to swap out the cache with whatever you want. So we have a standard in-memory cache, which is very similar to what was implemented in the 1.0, except without Redux. But then you can swap that out, for example, if you have really large nested payloads. We have a community-driven graph cache that is really, really great and performant, especially for reads. Or in the future, we kind of see the community building their own custom caches, maybe for async storage in React Native, for example, or introducing a cache for MobX. So that's kind of all the exciting developments that are happening with the cache. And then our new network stack called Apollo Link is really great because it allows you to hook into the request cycle at any point. So it allows you to do really cool stuff with directives. It's observable based, so you can return multiple results from your GraphQL operation. And yeah, we're really excited about it. If you want to learn more, come check out my talk tomorrow. I'll be on the main stage, I think right before lunch. So yeah, so I'm going to turn it to Yuri, who can
Yuri.
talk about the exciting things that are happening with real time.
Thanks, Peggy. Thanks.
you need maybe.
So I won't add a lot of what Peggy and Gerard already said. My other talk was about real time, and I don't think it's interesting right now. I'll just, like Peggy said, it's way easier and better now to integrate real-time capabilities like subscriptions and live into Apollo Client 2.0. And also as an Angular developer, I had to mention that Apollo Client 2.0 is a huge step for Angular. And it's actually the first time that we're going to release Apollo Angular as 1.0, as like an official release. Because now you can use Apollo Angular, like the wrapper for Angular around Apollo Client with NGRX, like the official store from the Angular team, written by Rob Warman, but also with the with the link of the network layer using the Angular's HTTP service. And
Cool.
that actually gave us like a really nice thing where now you can use Apollo Client 2.0 with native script and Angular just out of the box. So this is very, very powerful. All that work on the Angular side was done not by me, but by Camille, which done the whole releasing process of and the coding for that. So yeah, it was an amazing thing, and it was all possible through thanks to Apollo Client 2.0.
So yeah.
Well, that's awesome.
You.
Well, we couldn't miss this, contribution from some of the team members of Apollo Client. So that was great. Thank you. Okay. Let's see. Okay, let's move quickly. So we are going to use project implementing an Instagram clone. So that's going to be the tool that I'm going to use to compare these two different clients. And this is the overall architecture. So I'm going to use React and then these two different clients. On the server side, I'm going to use this GraphQL, which is a GraphQL server as a service, which I can just quickly configure to get my GraphQL schema working without much more work. So the schema is going to be really easy. If you are not familiar with GraphQL schema, this is just defining some of the types that I'm going to use and fetch from my clients. And these are some of the fields. So basically I have this description, and I'm going to allow the users to post some pictures. And I'm going to use this little schema. Maybe you recognize the type for the strings. The only thing maybe that is not familiar is this exclamation point, and that's to make these fields mandatory. In order to put this live, I'm going to use what it's called the GraphQL CLI. And just by using the schema that I just showed you, I can run some command line commands and put this on the GraphQL server and start using it right away. So that's something that you may want to do and use for proof of concepts. So what's the setup like for these two different clients? So while I set up this solution, I found out different things. So I'm going to give an overview of the different findings. So one of the things that I found with Relay Modern is that I had to introduce this compiler. So there is an extra dependency, and that's going to give me also some performance improvements, as I was explaining before. There's also some new environment that I need to be aware. We have this network and store, and that's going to handle communications with the GraphQL server, and the store is going to have the cache on the client. We're going to use this via an attribute, and that's how it's going to be set up on the client. So this is more or less an overall of the setup for Relay Modern. For Apollo Client, we have some other dependencies. What we are using is GraphQL tag, and that's going to be on our queries. Then on the setup of the Apollo Client, we have this network interface that is setting up the communications. Usually, we are going to introduce a high-order component. That's going to be the Apollo provider. And I'm going to rate these two different clients with 3 stars. I don't think there was anything complex by doing this setup, so I was able to set up these 2 different clients pretty easily. Just had to define this endpoint on the GraphQL server, and it was working right away. I'm going to cover the different queries that we have. We have queries, mutations, and subscriptions. So I'm going to cover these 3 different areas and what were the difficulties while trying to implement those. So queries work in GraphQL work in this way. We can use these query API, and that will go through the schema and fetch some data that usually will come from a database. And in our case, it's using this GraphQL. So let's see what I found out. So in order to run the queries, we have this concept of query renderer, and that's going to be a component that will require this environment and query objects. The actually query generation is automated. We are using this concept of fragments, and it's going to execute the queries for me and compose them in a way that I don't have to worry. So I can set up my projects by using these query renderer components, and these are going to be my SAP for me. So that means that this is a little bit more opinionated. So I need to use this relay modern approach to build and architect my application. When we move into Apollo Client, what we use is this GraphQL high-order components, which is quite familiar in React. What we do is we have this manual query generation. We are not using the client to build it, so it's our responsibility to build these queries trees. It's a little bit more flexible, so we can achieve more control on what we want to build. And I'm going to rate this with 2 stars. So there's some complexity involved when I want to architect my solution by using either of the 2 clients. Some of the features good in Relay Modern, I cannot find them in Apollo Client, but they end up in the same middle place. So if you want some more opinionated approach, Relay Modern could be a good option for you. If you want more control, you can use Apollo Client. For mutations. Mutations is the way how we modify our data model. And we are using this mutation API. And in Relay Modern, we use what is called commit mutation, and we use this environment which sets the network and the store. And we're using these abstractions to update our schema. And we introduce these concepts of connection. We also introduce fields and what is called link records. And this will be handling the mutations, the changes that we do in our schema. The good thing is that this will handle optimistic updates for us, so it gives us some extra features. When we implement the same mutations in Apollo Client, we use what is a common approach in React. We use properties, props, to run these mutations. And that is also using GraphQL high-order component, which in this case is using the mutate API. Then we can use these reducers and arguments to actually update the store. And this is also familiar if you are using Redux in your team. It also handles optimistic updates, so that's paired with Relay Modern. And I'm going to rate Apollo Client slightly better because I think that the approach is a little bit easier when running the mutations. It also follows the same approach with queries, so it makes it a little bit easier. On Relay Modern, we introduce new abstractions. I guess that the benefit of this is when your solution gets more complex, these abstractions will shine. But for easy proof of concepts, they get a little bit into the way. Subscriptions. So this is the last area I'm going to look, and this is how we achieve real time. And this is a really interesting feature that we have not before. And this is from open source projects. So this is something that you should look into. Subscriptions work in a little bit different way than queries and mutations. What we do is we subscribe to mutations on the server side, and this will create events that then will be broadcasting. So we have a separate store that is recording these events, and then this will be broadcasted to the client. So let's see the differences between implementing real-time with these two different clients. The way we do that with Relay Modern is by using this request subscription, and that also uses this environment that we define during setup. We're going also to use the same abstractions that we use for mutation. So we have the connection, we also have the fields and link records. For Apollo, we have a different API. We are using subscribe to more in this case. We're also using the familiar approach of using reducers and passing arguments, so that's a little bit easier. And in this case, I'm going to rate both with 2 stars. Subscription is still, I guess, still in the early stages, but they were really easy to implement anyway. So in the final round, which is more or less the final overview, I'm going to say that Relay Modern is an awesome option. It's familiar if you know the Facebook way, if you are familiar with these concepts from Relay Classic, it will be a good option for you. We have this viewer, connectors, pagination cover for you, so you don't have to implement them. There's also a lot of improvements when you have complex schemas, and the compiler will just optimize those for you, so you don't have to worry. For Apollo Client is also another awesome option. If you need to use other frameworks other than React, it's definitely an option that you should look into. If you're also familiar with Redux, that's an option that you can use behind the scenes. And there's less concepts to learn. So if you need to get results quick, Apollo Client is definitely for you. I'm going to rate both as an awesome option, so I don't know if I could give you enough details, but I hope you enjoy the journey. If you want to know more, I have this proof of concept using both libraries, so you can see it by yourself. And there's also some more detail in this blog post that I wrote some time ago. This is a tool similar to the Slido or Slido that we are using during the conference, and you can see some of these concepts implemented in a more complex application. That was all. Thank you very much.